Welcome to the next edition of Grid Forward Chats. I'm Bryce Yonker with Grid Forward. Today we have with us Brenda Chew and Franco Albi. Thanks for being on.
Thank you, Bryce.
Yeah, thanks.
We'll start with you, Brenda. Can you share a little bit about your background, what led you to Virtual Peaker, and what are you doing these days?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, and glad to share the stage with you, Franco. So, my name is Brenda Chew. I am the Director of Product at Virtual Peaker. And previous to joining this company, I had a much heavier research focus where I led the research team at the Smart Electric Power Alliance, and we did a ton of research with utilities, their programs, understanding what DER programs were taking place. And I focus a lot on demand flexibility. And I spent a lot of time writing reports and papers about how to unlock the value of DERs. What are the obstacles? So often the obstacles were, hey, we don't have the tools to do this yet. We don't have these capabilities. And so it's been a really cool transition to be able to peel back the curtain, maybe jump past the curtain, really digging in, working with the developers and seeing how software and those tools and capabilities can really help to work on the solution towards unlocking those values of DERs.
Great. Over to you, Franco. You're at Portland General Electric, but again, tell us a little bit about who you are, what brought you there, and what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. And it's a privilege to be on the show today. I guess just start with my background and maybe touch on a little bit about PGE so folks have a sense of the company. So I've been in the industry for over 20 years. And what I love about it is it continues to be new. I started in transmission line design, and I was always curious about where things came from. So you look up at the transmission towers and the poles, and you see the wires. You're like, where does that electricity come from? So then I got into generation, and I got curious about, why do we pick the generation resources that we pick? So then I got into our long-term resource planning and figured out, hey, why are we looking at these types of resources through this process? And it's really all driven by the customer needs. And so that's really taken me full circle back into the distribution system and distributed energy resources and virtual power plants. And so it continues to be an exciting industry, an exciting place to work. Just briefly about PGE, we are about a 2 million customer company, and I separate that from being about a 1 million meter company. A lot of times folks will talk about the number of meters that they have, but especially the conversation that we're having today, it's really about the number of customers and what the customers are looking for. So we're our service territory is wholly in Oregon, and we have generation that extends outside of the state. We're about 35 to 40% renewable at this point, and we're really focused on our 2030 and 2040 goals and state requirements to be 80% decarbonized by 2030 and 100% emission-free by 2040.
Great. So we'll start with a big, broad question. I'm going to kick it over to you first, Franco. What's going on around utilities and as utilities prioritize managing their grids? What's kind of top of mind and really at the front of the list for places that are prioritizing?
Yeah, man, such a great question. I'll go back. It's the customer needs. But more specifically, for the last 10, 15 years, we've really been thinking about decarbonization and doing so through electrification. And we saw forecasts of electric vehicle adoption, for example, building electrification, devices that would help us with kind of managing the usage of energy, like smart thermostats. And that was a pretty significant increase in energy usage through electricity. But what's really fascinating now is we are seeing customer needs orders of magnitude higher, a level that we haven't really seen since the 60s and 70s, coming from things like data centers. And data centers are, again, just us. It's us using technology. It's us using Snapchat, Instagram, and it's the advent of generative AI and the processing of large language models. And so we're really seeing a significant increase in the processing needs of those facilities, which translates to energy need, and working with those customers to figure out how do we meet that need in the most efficient, clean, and reliable way possible. The other thing that we're seeing, kind of the third piece, in addition to the general electrification, is the automation. So Oregon has done a great job of really bringing home manufacturing. One of our largest customers, Intel, is in our service territory. You've probably read in the news, seen in the news, a significant investment from them in terms of economic development to support chip manufacturing. So those are really the three big pieces that are driving energy needs in the utility space, not only in Portland, not only in Oregon, but across the country and across the globe.
Anything else to add on that, Brenda?
Yeah, I should note that I manage our DERMS, our Distributed Energy Resource Management System platform, as well as our forecasting system, and we sit more on the grid edge of managing EVs and batteries and water heaters, thermostats, EVSEs, et cetera, kind of the whole gamut. So the view we have and that I've had over these past few years at Virtual Peaker with working with a wide range of utilities is they're all grappling with a different variables, but kind of similar to what Franco's talking about. We have some utilities where they were always a summer peaking utility. Now there's extreme winter events, and now they're a winter peaking utility, and they have to figure out how to quickly scale up and solve some of those problems. Or there's just so much uncertainty and different pressures and variables that utilities are facing today that they did not need to face in the last decade or two, where how can you anticipate electrification and EV adoption happening at scale? Sometimes people are saying, oh, the boom is coming quicker than you think. And then all of a sudden there's a new article saying, oh, it's a bust, that was overhyped. But it doesn't really matter because utilities have to be available and ready for whatever scenario happens, because you need to be reliably providing that electricity to all your customers, and you need to be ready for all these different situations that may come up. Otherwise, it's just, there are different challenges that have already cropped up that we've seen over the past few years. And how can you know that a pandemic's going to hit? And then all of a sudden, there's these massive human migratory patterns happening. Your load growth happens much faster than you expected, or decarbonization goals, different policy or market changes. Everyone's facing different things. And at the same time, customers are much more quickly adopting DERs. And so from our lens and view, and what we've seen is just a much greater appetite from the utilities to look at how they can leverage DERs as part of a solution to manage some of these different challenges that they're seeing increasingly cropping up along the grid.
I think you guys got into this some, but with so many priorities for electric grid managers right now, why is it important that flexibility is a critical aspect and outcome that folks really work on addressing? And I'll kick that over to you first, Franco.
Yeah, I'll continue to build on what Brenda was mentioning. We've traditionally thought of the system as one way, from generation to load. And obviously, as customers are adopting more of these distributed devices, that system is requiring the capability to be more two-way. And so you can call that flexibility, and it's flexibility across the system, from customer usage to the infrastructure, the poles and wires on the transmission distribution system, and flexibility of the generation as well. In particular, as generation is more weather dependent, wind and solar depend on the sun and wind. So having the ability to flex with energy generation as well as energy consumption is critically important. And what I wanted to piggyback on, Brenda, that you mentioned, customers are adopting DERs faster than ever. Customers are buying electric vehicles not because they want to adopt a DER, because they want to have an electric vehicle. They want to have reduced maintenance, have lower gas costs. They're not buying thermostats because they want to buy a DER. They are using those thermostats to control the temperature of their homes from their phone. And so we have this amazing opportunity where customers are already opting into the devices that can create that flexibility. And now they're looking to us to say, hey, how do we unlock that? How do we more actively participate in our energy consumption in a way that makes it as affordable as possible and keeps the lights on reliably?
Yeah, and I'll add, I think that there's this optionality benefit when it comes to virtual power plants, because there can be a wide range of use cases that can be deployed to help solve problems. I think Virtual Peaker, when Bill founded this company, his vision was to make demand as controllable as a gas turbine generator. And he talks about that a lot. And so that's one big use case is how can we use this for peak events much more easily? There's all these unpredictable weather events taking place. Can that be used as a way to smooth out renewable energy variation along the grid? But then there's also other ways that optionality can be a benefit as well from DERs. You could deploy them much more locationally. If all of a sudden everyone starts getting excited about their electric vehicles and one neighborhood, they just crop up in a couple months, you don't want to have that transformer blow out. You need to figure out how you can help manage those different resources. And DERs could also be a way you could manage those EVs. You could manage other smart devices and technologies in those homes, in those regions. So you could think about it for the distribution benefits, the broader capacity benefits, for clean energy benefits. There's kind of just a lot of ways that it can be leveraged. And I think that flexibility ends up, sometimes it's previously been seen as more of a obstacle or a con. But I actually think that there's a lot of benefits to it, especially as we see adoption continue to scale.
So you already brought up virtual power, but let's take a step back and kind of define it a little bit. I think most people in our community are pretty aware of and even working on aggregation of distributed resource assets for grid value. But maybe, Brenda, you can help us define what is a virtual power plant, VPP, if you're going to use an acronym, and why are a number of places starting to look into this more seriously? So over to you.
Yeah, virtual power plants, often seen as a buzzword, but at the end of the day, you can boil it all down to a virtual power plant is an aggregation of DERs, and they can be controlled by some higher level entity. It could be a utility, it could be Portland General Electric, it could be a third party aggregator, and typically all these different entities are using some sort of DERMS technology to manage and control those DERs. And what you get, the output of that, the power you get is virtual power. And in terms of some examples or why people are starting to take it more seriously, I think look no further than one of our friends over at Green Mountain Power and what's been going on over in Vermont. Vermont PUC, they just approved increasing the program caps at Green Mountain Power because they've seen so much success with their battery VPP program. I think that they saved up to $3 million a year over the last few years. They've been facing kind of resilience obstacles with a lot more winter events. And so the program cap has increased. They've had a lot of positive customer feedback from those programs. And I live in Rhode Island, so I'm also getting ISO New England energy prices and pass through. I understand, so I'm not upset with Rhode Island energy, but sometimes I can see how the typical customer will feel when they see their energy bills. It's really, really high. And so in some regions, especially in ISO New England, the energy burden could be really heavy. And I feel like I'm in a pretty privileged position, but I think it's 1 in 6 Americans are behind on their energy bills. Like 20 million Americans are energy burden, and virtual power plants can also be a way to really benefit those customers and help lower costs for everyone.
So I guess I'll ask you, Franco, why is Portland General interested in the aggregation of DERs for grid value? And then maybe more so than the why, like, what are you guys doing with that? Maybe you can start to talk a little bit about what you guys are working on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think something Brenda mentioned is really important, that why we do what we do is to power people's lives. And in order to make that happen, people have to be able to access the energy and to do it affordably. So that is front of mind. It's why we're focused on virtual power plant, to increase the utilization of the system so we don't have to build what I would call excess capacity, that we're utilizing more of what we already have. I think we did commit an industry faux pas. We started using terms that weren't defined. So for us with virtual power plant, it's very real. It's very real power, and it's more of a customer-centric kind of power plant. So we think of it across the entire value chain. How are the devices that customers are using going to connect into the grid, and how is that going to be orchestrated to provide the things that customers don't care about? Frequency of response, contingency reserves, power quality. They don't care about it until their lights flicker or their lights go out. Then they care. So it's looking across that whole value chain. So we think of the virtual power plant more as a how rather than a what. And then the what's underneath it are those devices. So we have right now 175,000 customers with thermostats that are participating in our programs today. Again, going back to the 2 million customers, 1 million meters that we serve today. Interestingly, we also have 5,000 customers that are participating through our EV managed charging program. But within our service territory, there are over 50,000 electric vehicles registered. So there's a lot of opportunity to better manage and better orchestrate the load on the system. To do that, the first thing that we need is visibility. So Brenda mentioned distributed energy resource management system. That is something that we are putting into place as we speak. It sits on top of our advanced distribution management system, which is the equivalent that gives us visibility to the poles and wires and the flows on the distribution system. So I'm happy to expand on either of those. I don't want to get too into the weeds too quickly, but it's all of those pieces that connect the customer experience through to managing the system in the ways that keep the lights on.
Yeah, well, we'll get into a little bit further. So I wanted to understand, and I'll have you start, Brenda, how do we bridge the gap between programs, right? Something that faces a customer and their resources, right? Their assets that are theirs, that are on their facilities, and the control room at the grid operator, right? So how do we bridge that gap so that you have a resource that you can call on and count on?
Yeah, this is a question I did a lot of thinking and research on before I also even came to Virtual Peaker. And maybe it's also related to what Franco is saying too. So there are a lot of different technologies that kind of use the term DERMS, but there are DERMS that sit closer to the operations and program side. And we kind of sit more closer to the grid edge and are connected to customers. And typically they're behind the meter assets. And being able to take those customer DER assets and operationalize them, make them a useful and reliable resource to those on the operations and planning end. And the way I see it, and some of those obstacles that kind of have plagued the DER space for a while now, is that operators and power purchasers typically are quite skeptical of the traditional demand response control strategies. I would frame the 500 plus virtual power plants that WoodMac cited are deployed in North America today as kind of conventional virtual power plants that use control strategies left over from the demand response era of the past 4 or 5 decades. And when I say kind of those control strategies, it's typically like a blanket control strategy. You kind of press the button and you're sending a single event signal to a wide range of DERs. And it kind of becomes what you see. You kind of press the button and what you get is what you get. Oftentimes what you get is all those DERs respond to that signal. And then I know people won't be able to see my hand while I'm kind of thinking about this, but people start to opt out, they override. Maybe those batteries run out of juice. Maybe they're smaller and they run out. And so you're not getting this kind of consistent power output from those DERs. And that kind of scares the operators and other folks that are on that more operations and planning side. I had done this research doing a lot of extensive interviews with utility staff on the operations side, and they were really scared of DERs that are quote unquote virtual. Franco's on on my good list. He's like, they're not virtual, they're real assets. But traditionally, and I'm positive that many people still feel this way today, that DERs are virtual, they're a risk. The utility doesn't own it. They don't know what the customer is going to do. They don't know what the customer's behaviors are going to be. And so they see it as we have strict performance criteria. We need to meet it. Reliability is first and foremost. And so can we really count on these DERs as an asset? And I think that blanket control strategy of kind of conventional virtual power plants, and the way you end up getting these kind of scraggly lines that end up kind of dropping off over that event window, you can't get this like clear supply block from DERs. And that's something we're trying to overcome with technology as a solution at Virtual Peaker, is this what we're calling top-line demand control capability. It's really focused on pushing past that kind of blanket control era and being able to leverage AI and what we're calling as model predictive control to be able to help shape that DER load, to kind of add a layer of situational awareness to what all the different DERs are doing, and then kind of call them in different ways so that you can give an operator a really clear power output across that full ecosystem of DERs and kind of overcome both the mental and cultural and, build that trust with the operators to know that DERs really can give you exactly what you need for that event window. We just needed, the right technology to be able to get there.
Anything else that you guys are learning to bridge that gap from programs to the operations room, Franco?
Yeah, I think we try to think of the VPP kind of as a dial that the customers can turn. And if you use that analogy and think of like a speaker system, if you don't have the capabilities behind the stereo, you can crank that dial up to 11 and you get a bunch of distortion. And so we're trying to bridge that process so that you don't get the distortion. So that if a customer wants to turn the dial to 1, maybe they have a thermostat, but that's it. They can participate that way. If they have a thermostat and an EV and a battery and solar panels, they can crank that up to 11 and they can still participate. A couple of things that we use to frame that. There's some principles around accelerating virtual power plant adoption. One is that we need to use every megawatt. So, the traditional concept of, hey, if you're over generating, we're going to curtail you. That can't be the answer, especially if it's solar, it's clean, we want to use it. We are pro solar. So if you're using every megawatt and you don't want to curtail it, that brings you to principle number 2. You got to be able to flow energy the other way. So you need to think about your design of your system, your standards, your protection schemes, all of those things that were designed in a way to make things safe and reliable for one-way flow now have to be redesigned for two-way flow. And then that brings you to the third principle of you want 1 and 2 so that you can orchestrate and flex the flow based on where generation's happening and where consumption is happening. And so if those things are true, then what must be true for our mindsets? The first is the customer is no longer passive. We now have active customers. Again, there's various levels of activity from the dial at 1 to the dial at 11. And as Brenda mentioned, we have to move away from centralized control to centralized coordination. There are different ways to get certainty of what's happening on your system beyond having direct control of every device. And if we start thinking about the number of devices we all have, the idea that we will have direct control of every single one is a misnomer. So how do we create the processes and the technology and implement them in a way where we have the visibility to orchestrate all of those things in harmony? So we're looking again at the whole ecosystem. Yes, we need tariffs designed to provide the right price signals, for example, but a tariff without a system that enables the delivery of the value from that is insufficient.
Brenda, I'll kick this one over to you. Top line demand control is not a term that I'm familiar with. So how would you define that as kind of going beyond where kind of a traditional aggregation of distributed resources or a VPP is currently?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I kind of said, I was talking about kind of conventional virtual power plants. And if we were to take a story of what that typically looks like, and I alluded to a little bit before, was, maybe the operations team says, planning team says, hey, programs team, oh man, tomorrow is going to be this extreme winter event. We need to turn every resource on that we can. Do you know how much you'll be able to give me? And maybe that customer program manager is like, I don't really know. I can kind of look at my past data and kind of extrapolate off of it generally what we typically may get. And we can use that as a bit of a number to work off of, but obviously I'll schedule it and I'll call it. And you call it and we kind of get that first drop off during that event window where everyone is, for example, reducing demand. And then it starts to kind of get overridden over time. You get that scraggly line. And with top line demand control, it's our idea of what the next generation of virtual power plants will look like. And I think that tying it to what Franco, you were saying, you guys want to have like distributed control. So you're not trying to centralize everything. Well, we're trying to think about, okay, well, instead of you having to worry about what every single battery and every single customer's thermostat is doing, we can be another input into there and try to reduce as much uncertainty into the planning process as possible. So you're not going to have to worry about, okay, how scrabbly is that going to be? Instead, it's, okay, hey, let's look at all of our resources in our service territory. We're going to have this event tomorrow. I can even go into the system or call an API and see, okay, out of this ecosystem of DERs, we can see exactly how much is generally going to be available. We can use model predictive control and AI to be able to know and estimate how much actual capacity is available right now and how much, based off of past performance, you will actually be able to get tomorrow for that event. And then also to be able to shape that performance so it looks like a supply block to that decentralized control room, for example. So when you think of a power supply curve and a power demand curve, you can use DERs and stack them like a supply brick instead of having to think about it as kind of this nominal or kind of inconsistent performance. And so it's really focused on taking that guesswork. We do this optimization and granular control based off of what the program parameters are, taking into account how much juice is in each of these batteries, what those customer preferences and constraints may be, but being able to manage and control it and kind of fend off different uncertainties to provide that consistent top line as you may have it. So that's kind of what we're thinking about and launch with top line demand control.
Costly distribution upgrades, frequent extreme weather events, demand surging from an onslaught of distributed energy resources adoption. Do these challenges sound familiar? If so, you need Virtual Peaker's cloud-based distributed energy platform. We're empowering modern utilities with next-generation virtual power plant solutions to maximize the value of DERs. The Virtual Peaker platform unifies all aspects of DER management, from DERMS to customer engagement and demand forecasting. Learn more at virtual-peaker.com.
Franco, I'm going to start this line of questions with you. I think many, and I would be in this camp, kind of argue that DERs matter really only if they can scale, right? And so how do we get there? Would you say that Portland General is there yet? Or what does it look like for an aggregation of DERs to get to a level where they scale and have a real impact on the way we're managing our systems?
Yeah, great question. I do think scale matters. And I think that at Portland General Electric, we're on a good trajectory. I mentioned the several 100,000 thermostats, and we're seeing similar trajectory for electric vehicles. Our peak load, summer peak load, is about 4,500 megawatts. And to Brenda's point, we're also dual peaking. Our winter peak load is about 4,200. And we have about 500 megawatts of solar panels on our system right now. But we don't have the control. We don't have the visibility even to them. Like I said, we don't need the control. We need the certainty so that we can orchestrate. So the devices are out there and they're growing. So we see that the scale is coming. Our challenge is to make sure we're ready to meet that scale with the technology to be able to integrate it, to be able to orchestrate it with the rest of the devices and the generation. And, one thing that I didn't talk about, I think is worth mentioning, there's been an additional focus on the distribution system because we are at capacity with our transmission system. While there's ample, wind resources in Wyoming and Montana and Desert Southwest solar, the ability to transmit that to the load centers is really constrained, and we're finding it's taking a very long time to increase the capacity on those systems. So the use of virtual power plants and orchestration of distributed resources is a great way to help us, again, increase the utilization of the existing system.
So over to you, Brenda, on scale. How do we get to scale that matters? And once we get to a certain level, how do we get to the next level where it even has more impact? So,
yeah, I think that this is kind of beyond the technology solution that I focus on, but I do think that as an industry as a whole, and we're thinking about virtual power plants and how they can scale, one really key part is how to really find effective, innovative models for attracting customers to participate. I think that's still a nut we're all trying to crack, is finding the best ways to engage customers. I'm an energy nerd, but I have a lot of non-energy nerd friends and people in my community who are environmentalists that care a lot about climate change, that in values, I think would be really excited to participate in a virtual power plant. They may even be participating in it and they don't realize it. And I think that there's just so much potential from the smart home technologies and the DERs that people are installing in their homes that we could be leveraging, but we haven't quite found ways to easily kind of move them into wanting to participate and seeing its value as much. And so I think when we're thinking about scale, I think finding those effective ways to incentivize them, to engage them, is really key so that it happens more organically. I think oftentimes it takes a lot of rolling up your sleeves and elbow grease to get people sometimes in your program. Some are much more successful than others, but I do think that's been kind of a constant obstacle for folks, is how to effectively run those customer programs and get people engaged in them and enjoying the experience and getting a lot of value out of it back. And then beyond that, to the next level, I think gets into this whole operationalizing DERs and getting to that next generation of virtual power plants. I think that there's been tremendous growth in virtual power plants. I'm so excited about it. When I saw that WoodMac report and the 500 number, I was like, wow, this has come such a long way from when I used to be doing this research myself. But then I also do think that there's still so much potential we can unlock, like Franco's talking about on the transmission side, on the distribution constraints. I think that as people get more comfortable with the technology that's advancing and what it can do with control and management of DERs, and how we can prove out how it can provide a good experience for the customers as well as those that are operating the grid, I think that there's a lot of value to unlock from there on.
So yeah, we're not going to have a scale problem. There are more DERs right now out there that are connected and participating. The challenge that we're going to have and do have is the orchestration. And making sure that those things can be seen, that customers are having a good experience when they participate. Quite frankly, there are more devices out there now that could enable our capabilities if we can engage with them. Quick stat, 1 in 7 vehicles in Oregon is sold as electric, and that's a 2023 stat. By 2029, we're expecting every other vehicle to be electric. So not going to be a problem getting the DERs to scale. The coordination needs to scale.
And I guess I'll ask a pretty pointed question on scale, which is price. So at scale, it's a different asset, so you can't compare them one-to-one, but you could say, hey, gas peaker plant or a whole bunch of aggregated resources. How competitive are virtual power plants from a price perspective when we start looking at them, in tens and hundreds of megawatts in systems across the country?
I'll take a first shot at that. The way that we look at it is through grid services. So regardless of what the device is or the generator is, what grid service does it provide? And again, this is not something that the customer cares about. So I'm not speaking like the customer facing, hey, what fast frequency response are you going to provide? We're not going to ask the customer that. But that's how we look at the value. And so when we aggregate 100,000 thermostats, 150,000 thermostats, batteries in people's homes, the solar, we're able to tie those to the grid services and say, hey, this is what we would otherwise have to use to serve that need. And so that helps us with leveling the playing field of the value, if you will. I think we should also just kind of acknowledge the ocean we're all swimming in. We're coming out of one of the highest inflationary periods in our history. So we're all feeling those cost pressures, and that's very top of mind. We're also seeing the impacts of climate change. Wildfire mitigation is a significant focus and needs to be. And so that's also putting additional price pressure on energy. So if we think about all of those components, we have to maximize the orchestration of all of the resources available to us. That's the only way that we're going to be able to manage the price impacts overall. We also think about it as called total energy wallet or total energy burden. If you're buying an electric vehicle and you didn't have one before and you charge at home, your electric bill is probably going to go up, but your gas bill is going to go down. Your maintenance bill is going to go down. So as we think about this, it is really about the broader ecosystem and how the pieces fit together.
Anything on the cost or value side of it, Brenda, to add?
Yeah, I think that there's been a good number of analysis, some great reports that have come out that have analyzed the virtual power plants against some of these other resources. And I think the DOE cited it in one of their recent reports that virtual power plants can be 60% lower in net cost than a natural gas peaker plant. And so when you're looking at procuring new peaker plant resource, for example, you can just already see how much of a better price point that is just looking at those different resources.
All right, 2 more questions. The first one's going to be around national policy and investments. So there's a ton of money flowing around to support accelerating the grid. So maybe you both can react or reflect on the sort of impact that you see that happening with regards to virtual power resources. And additionally, one of those agencies put out a report about a commercial liftoff report for virtual power taking off. So what sort of impact do you see the federal attention, whether it's publications and analysis or especially the funding out there having in this space? Brenda, maybe you can start.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're referencing that DOE virtual power plant liftoff report, and they had a series of other kind of papers that have been coming out. But I thought there were some really great insights from that research. The things that stood out to me was, one, they're trying to encourage and triple virtual power plant capacity by 2030, and reference a lot of this analysis on kind of the cost savings. I think virtual power plants can save over $10 billion per year for our energy system investments. And the other big theme was how virtual power plants can really help us to more efficiently use the grid, how you can use them for those distribution, the transmission resources, additional to kind of more peaking opportunities as well. But I do think that we're seeing a lot of growth because of this money flowing in, different state incentives. People are increasingly adopting different DERs, and I think that has also been helping to move the market. But yeah, in terms of kind of policy and what we kind of need to really fully unlock it further, I really like the example of in Massachusetts, the state government, they started offering discounts through their Clean Peak program. And so there's different ways that you can also help to unlock further value from virtual power plants. They, for example, have a distribution circuit multiplier that gives 2x the compensation if you are leveraging DERs in an area that also has a constraint along that circuit. And so I think there's different movement in different regions that's also helping to really increase virtual power plant deployment. And they're clearly pushing for it really strong over there at the DOE too. And that's really exciting.
So Franco, on your perspective, either policy or funding or analysis, what do you think is kind of helping push the idea forward?
Yeah, thanks. So that goes to what Brenda said and some additions. Meeting customers' energy needs is really a national security priority. When we start looking at industrial customers that might move overseas because they have challenges getting the energy need, that's a big risk. There's a huge focus in keeping jobs in the country, keeping manufacturing in the country. So we're definitely seeing that as an ongoing national priority. It really emphasizes the need for these public-private partnerships, leveraging purpose-built, digital-born companies and partnering with long-standing utilities that have the capability to orchestrate is really, really important. So we don't all have to build the same thing individually and independently. We can learn and work with each other. The federal support has been fantastic. Huge credit to the Department of Energy. Really good relationships with Jigar Shah and Jen Downing on the virtual power plant liftoff report. The companion report, I like to call it, Innovative Grid, just came out. They're really, really good. They approach the topics at the right level, so you can not only see what they're about, what some of those barriers are, but also some of the solutions that as an industry and as a country we're talking about deploying together. So the more that we can collaborate, the better. The national labs are fantastic resources to be able to learn from and to pilot And then we can use that information to scale and deploy a lot faster.
Nice shout out. Yeah, we're doing a special session next month with the DOE office on the grid liftoff report that's out. So last question, I'll have you start, Franco. Let's take our futurist hats on. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen in an ever-changing environment quickly, but maybe you can take a best stab at 2-3 years out, and then again 8 to 10 years out. So let's call it short and mid-term. How much of a role do you envision aggregated distributed resources playing on the grid? Quantify it however you'd like.
Sure. Yeah. In the near term, we see 25% of our energy needs being served through virtual power plants. And what I mean by that is it's not just a peak load reduction. We're going to be looking at this 24/7, 365 and shifting when energy is used. So customers are going to choose to use energy at different times. They're going to use it earlier in the day. They're going to choose to generate energy and charge batteries at different times. So those batteries can be discharged in the traditional peaks. So we're really maximizing the flexibility, and that's happening now. And in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to see that double and triple. If you go out further, if you go out 10 years, 15 years, I envision a Western energy grid and probably a national grid where there is sufficient dispatchable capacity that's non-emitting that is going to be able to flow through new transmission lines and go from load centers across the country from generation across the country to those various load centers. And so we're truly going to see the capacity of the electric grid that we've built unlocked in those next 10 to 15 years.
Great. Last word over to you, Brenda.
Great. Yeah. I think that in the short to medium term over these next 2 to 3 years, we're going to really start rolling out DERs into that control room and kind of proving out, building that trust across those different stakeholders that it works, it can work really well. The customers will have a good experience, and look at all these different use cases you can really leverage this flexible resource. And when I think about 8 to 10 years, I also think about it in terms of kind of on the macro scale, looking at that DOE report, the economics of it all. For 2222, by 2030, what compliance may look like then, I do think that the future is looking bright and much more distributed. And I see us getting towards that next generation of virtual power plants, really leveraging DER capabilities at that next level, leveraging kind of more advanced technology capabilities, and getting them more in the markets, in day-to-day grid operations, and having customers have a really, really great experience. So I see it as cleaner and a much more efficient grid.
Well, thank you both for being on. You're on the forefront of one of the most active areas in the entire industry. So thanks for taking some time to explore it with us today. And we look forward to following the exciting efforts that you're both working on.
Thank you for bringing us together, Bryce, and great to be on the podcast with you, Brenda.
Thanks, likewise.
Thanks again to our season sponsor, Virtual Peaker. If you enjoy Grid Forward Chats, please follow us on your favorite podcast platform, give us a like or a review, and tell your colleagues. You can listen to all episodes and learn more about our efforts to advance the grid at gridforward.org.